This is Art 120, Photography 1, and this is the first in a series of videos in which we are going to take our files from our cameras that have been captured in the raw file format and put them through our basic workflow to get them ready for output. For this first assignment, we're really going to only put our files through the basic workflow in Camera Raw, and then in subsequent videos we will get into other processing and more intermediate and advanced options for the different dialog boxes we're going to be using. So for the class we're using primarily Photoshop, the Camera Raw processor that is embedded or bundled with Photoshop, and then also the program called Bridge, which is going to be used for batch processing and archiving pictures. So to start, we're just going to launch Photoshop. To find Photoshop, if you're working on a computer at school, it's embedded in the dock at the bottom. It's indicated by PS for Photoshop. Photoshop is an Adobe software program. You can also do a quick search for it here, or you can navigate to it through your applications folder, which you'll have to locate. There's on this computer there's a series of Adobe programs, but here is the PS program. We're going to be working in Photoshop 2020, which is part of the Creative Cloud. When you first launch Photoshop, this is the window that will appear. What we're going to have to do now is just navigate to our folder that has our files. So I'm going to click Open, and you'll see it goes right to my raw folder, which I was last in. So for this assignment, which you'll be uploading to Google Drive, which will be assignment 2, you should have a series of 3 folders. Those folders should be raw, which you put your raw files in, your work folder, which will be your work files. After you process your raw files, you'll have to save them as a different file format. We'll be saving them as PSDs, and then finally, you'll have files that are for output, which will be for screen resolution and sizing so that we can view them on screen. And those files will be smaller files in terms of size and resolution, and they'll be saved as JPEGs. So we're going to have a series of 3 folders in each one of our assignment folders. So now I'm going to just navigate to my raw folder, and I'm going to select the same image we worked on in class, which is this number 015. You'll see that the file format is TIFF, so it's an actually open source file format. Your raw files will be called probably something different depending on the camera that you're using. So they might be like a Canon file or a Nikon file format, depending on the camera company that you're using or camera that you're using. So I'm going to just go here and click Open. And what will be launched is what's called our Camera Raw dialog box. And this Camera Raw dialog box is one in which we are going to be able to set our basic settings over our photograph before it opens in Photoshop. There's just a couple things to note before we get into the actual processing of the file. First is that our raw files are just raw data. They're known as bilinear code. And when you open them into the Camera Raw, what you're actually looking at is not the actual bitmap or digital photograph that we'll be able to output to print or to screen or however else. What we're actually looking at is an approximation of the raw data that was captured by the camera. And all we're going to be doing is setting a series of different commands over the picture, but it's not actually going to save over the picture. What will happen are those series of settings get saved as what's called an XMP file. And that XMP file essentially is just data saying we're going to make these changes so that once we actually open this file into Photoshop and we have to save it as a different file format, these are the settings that have been applied. Just know that the Camera Raw processor that we're working in is what we call non-destructive, meaning that we're actually not throwing away information yet. But once we get into Photoshop and you start moving pixels around or changing the values of pixels, really is what we're doing, that actually starts to throw information away. So we call that a destructive program. So the idea is that we want to try to do as much work as possible here before we enter that destructive mode of working in Photoshop. Really, if you get good at working in this dialog box and Camera Raw, you could probably do, depending on the kind of work that you're doing, but probably somewhere between 80 to 90, maybe even more, higher percentage of your work here. So we're going to just start off with working in the basic mode and just talking about the interface. and just opening the file and getting it ready to version in Photoshop. So a couple things before we get started with looking at the basic functions and basic commands that we're going to be putting the image through. First is to know that what we're looking at again is the approximate image and what it's going to be if we did not apply any settings. Just a couple of commands and quick ways to toggle around your image that will be really helpful that are also the same quick keys that you'll use in Photoshop. The first is how to zoom in and out. So if you hit and hold down the command button, which is on either side of the space bar, and then you hit the plus once, plus again, plus again, plus again, you'll see that it starts to zoom in. And if I hit command and I hold it down and I hit command minus once and keep hitting it, you'll see that it zooms out. So this is it's not changing the size of your photograph. All this is doing is actually getting us closer by zooming in or zooming out. You'll see in the bottom left hand corner over here as I hit command plus or command minus, that percentage changes. And again, this is just zooming in or zooming out. It's not changing the actual size of the photograph. If I hit command 0, the picture will go back to what we say fit to screen for the window size that we have open here. Also useful to know, if you hit command plus and we zoom in and let's say, oh, actually I don't want to see this part of the picture, but I want to see more to the right. If you move the cursor into the picture, so anywhere in the picture, and you hold the space bar down, the cursor will become the hand tool. Then if you click, it turns into a grab tool. And if you click and you hold it down and then you move the picture, you can see you can move it left or right. You're grabbing the picture and moving it around. And that's just by holding the space bar and then clicking, dragging, and then letting off. And this becomes very useful when you need to navigate around your picture for either spotting or looking at sharpening or looking at color or selections and so forth. So I'm going to hit command 0 again and go back to full screen. So again, just know command plus, minus, zoom in, zoom out. To get the hand tool anytime you're within the image, just hold down the space bar. Down at the bottom, we're going to always start here and look at this, what looks like a hyperlink at the bottom of the page. If we click on here, this is going to open up our preferences for our file. Now, if you're working on your own computer, once you set this once, it should be saved so that you don't need to go through every time, but it's always a good idea to just look and glance down at the bottom before you actually start putting your picture through the workflow. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change our color space. It used to be that Adobe RGB 1998. RGB is red, green, blue. And this is when this color space was devised back in 1998. This used to be the largest color space or largest color gamut that we could work in. Now, because of our printing technology being more advanced and also the screen gamut being wider, we can work in a bigger gamut or bigger color space called ProPhoto RGB. So we're going to select ProPhoto RGB. Right now I'm not going to get into this too much, but what I would like you to do is change your bit depth from 8 bits per channel, which is 24 bits total for those 3 channels of red, green, and blue, to 16 bits, which will change our bit depth to 48 bit. And again, I will talk about this more later. Image sizing. We're going to go down here and click off of this resize to fit button, and all this is going to do is it's going to lock in what is our native resolution for the camera that we use, and it will be the megapixel size. So we're going to leave that at the default. We're not going to upsample or downsample from here. Later on we'll do this in Photoshop. Resolution. We're going to set this, probably when you open up this dialog box, it's going to be set to 300. We're going to change it to 360, which is the resolution that our printers print best at, either 360 or 240. We're going to put in the larger number. Also, just make sure that your sharpen for button here for screen or whatever else is clicked off. We don't want to let the camera raw preferences sharpen. We will do more selective sharpening later. Photoshop, also open in Photoshop as smart objects, also clicked off. Later on in Photo 2, this is a function we use more often. We're not going to use it so much in Photo 1. Then after you hit those preferences for your picture, just click OK, and you'll see that that dialog box at the bottom, or I'm sorry, that link at the bottom has now been set. And again, it's a good idea every time you open up one of your raw files to just glance down there and make sure that you are working in the proper preferences. All right, just couple other things about the information that we're seeing right now. Up at the top, you'll see the camera or the camera back that was used for the capture, also the name of the file. If I move my cursor anywhere over the image, you'll see appear above the histogram the numbers for R, G, and B, which are just numbers that are assigned to each one of those channels for each one of those colors, red, green, or blue. Later on, we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Going over to the histogram, you're going to see we have a histogram here, which tells us a lot. Tells us that this image has more pixels in probably the 3/4 tone and shadow areas than it does in highlighted areas. If you look at the picture, that makes sense. It wasn't shot in a bright high key setting. It was late daylight kind of setting, so it's a much darker photograph overall. Above the histogram, you're going to see on the left-hand side, there is a black triangle. There's one also on the right-hand side. These are just indicating what are the different points on the left-hand side, and get used to the left-hand side being the shadow areas, or the black point, and then the right-hand side, the highlight areas, or the white point. Those triangles, if you click on and off, you'll see there's a white bounding box that appears. And for now, just leave those white bounding boxes clicked on. What that will show us when we zoom in and zoom out are areas of our picture where we are throwing away information or where they are clipping. And you can see there's some clipping that's happening in the shadows, and it shows up as these little blue pixels. Those aren't actually in the photograph. Those are just clipping warning. We will also probably see some highlight clipping, maybe not yet, but as we set our white point, we might see some here happening in other parts of the picture. Again, I'm moving around the image by hitting Command plus minus and then just using the space bar to get the hand tool. Okay, so just a couple other things before we get into processing the image. Below the histogram, you're going to see ISO, which refers to the sensitivity of this sensor when the picture was captured onto the sensor. So you can see I had it set at 200, which is lower than the median 400 that we sort of say is the kind of overall kind of well-rounded ISO. So it's a little bit lower, which allows for hopefully a little bit cleaner, a little less noisy photograph. This is an older digital back, so there's actually quite a bit of noise that we see in this picture. 80 millimeter refers to the lens size. Just really quickly, in a medium format digital camera, 80 millimeter is quote unquote a normal focal length lens. This would be the equivalent of your 50 millimeter in a 35 millimeter camera, or a 35 millimeter in your Rebel 7 Ti. So just know that this is, kind of the equivalent of quote unquote that normal size focal length lens. Next to that, you'll see f11, which is kind of, again, in the middle. F11 means that you're going to have probably, for this distance to subject, probably a good range of focus. And you can see there's nice sharp focus in the foreground that goes probably to close to the edge of this box here, this gearbox or whatever this is. Next to the aperture is the shutter speed. So 1/90th of a second sits between kind of the normal full stops that we use of 1/60th and 1/25th. So sitting kind of between there, ensuring that the picture is not achieving any motion blur. There's maybe a little blur that I am seeing as I kind of zoom in, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Below that, you're going to see there's an edit button, and those are just automated settings. Don't click those. You'll see there's one that just says auto, and that's going to just set all these different auto settings throughout the picture. And then also B and W, which is referring to black and white. Later on, we're going to convert to black and white in Photoshop in a much more advanced way, so we're not going to use this conversion here. You'll see to the right hand side there's all these different buttons. We're not going to mess with any of those right now. We'll get to those when we get into the intermediate camera raw processing. Those are retouching buttons, also cropping buttons and presets and so forth. But for now, we're just really concerned about the basic drop-down menu here. The profile, color profile, also just leave it on Adobe Color for now. Don't worry about any of these other ones. We're not going to let any automated profile kind of change the selection of our picture. We're just going to control this manually. So below the profile, we're going to click on the basic button, and what's going to appear are a series of sliders and then also some drop-down menu, or one drop-down menu. that will control just really the general exposure of the picture, also setting, again, what are called our white and black points, and then also color, contrast, and then a little bit of enhancement through what we call the texture, clarity, and dehaze sliders, which are really just kind of boosting contrast selectively in certain areas of the picture to create a specific effect, such as texturing or clearing up the picture or dehazing the picture. Then finally, the vibrance and saturation, which refers to the colors of the picture, which, again, just to note, we are working in our camera raw processor. We are going to be working in color, but then once we get into Photoshop, we'll be converting to black and white. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and we're going to set our white point and our black points. Now, what we're trying to do and achieve by setting these points is an exposure that fulfills the full range of our, essentially where our histogram falls between the 0 and 255 number, meaning that we're utilizing the full pixel values that were allowed to create a continuous tone throughout the picture. So I'm going to go to the white point slider, and what I want you to do is just sort of bring it to 100, and you see all of a sudden all these red pixels kind of appear. Those are not in the picture. That's just showing you where you are clipping or where you're throwing away information. That's bad, right? So you can see your histogram now is pressed up against the right hand side, and that means that we're blowing out or getting to a place where our highlights are going off of the charts. So that means that when you go to make an inkjet print, no ink would be put down in that area, and it would really be kind of an eyesore in the photographic print. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that highlight, or white point slider, sorry, and bring it back until we don't see any clipping occurring. And it's really kind of around 50. If I zoom in a little bit, we'll see maybe just a tiny bit of clipping here. That's okay. That's a specular highlight that is, kind of off the charts. So now if I look at the picture, you can see from 0 to 50, really it pops a lot more, and it's bringing a lot more highlight in. Now we may make some adjustments after to the overall picture by bringing up or down the exposure, but for now we're just going to set that white point where we think that it overall looks pretty good without blowing out too much. I'm going to bring it up a little bit higher. I'm going to bring it up to 60 so we can just see how we can use this slider in conjunction with the highlight slider. Then we're going to set our black points. So we're going to zoom in and we're going to look, and you can see some of those blue dots that are indicating clipping in the shadows or the black areas of the picture. So I'm going to take that black point slider and I'm going to bring it up until that clipping basically goes away, and that ensures that we maintain or hold on to the detail in those shadow areas. Just so we can see 25% the difference from 0 to 25. Not a lot, not a huge difference, but again, we've protected now our shadows and we do have nice detail and information in those areas. Last thing I'm going to show you just kind of quickly are the other two sliders that sit above the whites and the blacks, are the shadow and highlight sliders. And what these do are actually move the quarter tones around in the picture and help actually retain some of and recover some of those lost areas. So if I take this highlight slider and I move it all the way up, you can see then again I'm clipping again because I'm bringing it off the charts. But if I move it down, I can actually recover some of those shadows, some of those highlights, and now pretty much there's almost no clipping occurring. Maybe I would slide the highlight down a little bit and try to cover. And if they clip a little bit, we're not going to worry about this because we're going to work with this in conjunction with the in Photoshop. Really what I'm looking at here is the histogram, and if we're losing a little bit of detail, not a big deal. Really what we want to try to do is move the edge of that histogram kind of closer to the edge of the picture without letting it fall completely off. So I'm going to start around 52. I think that's pretty good. Now the shadow slider will open up our shadow, so I'm going to bring that up a little bit. And really what I'm looking at is sort of that netting area, and I'm looking to see what looks good overall without it looking like we're capturing too much of a range. And I think so far to look at those sliders. I think those are good numbers overall. So plus 39 on the shadows, and you can see if we went back to 0, how much darker they are. Go to plus 39. I think plus 39 is too high. I'm going to go down to 25. I'm going to let them still have some richness in those kind of shadow areas because this was shot late in the day, and I do know that's a little bit darker overall. And then all I would do is go back up to both the exposure and contrast sliders and kind of move them around, and this is where it becomes a little bit more subjective, and you get to sort of decide where you want your values to fall. Again, I remember this being a little dark because it was a little late in the day. So I might bring down the exposure a little bit, maybe not quite that much, maybe, yeah, negative points, yeah, let's see, bring it to about negative 10. I think that's pretty good. Contrast to me, there's something about the way that this picture is rendered right now. I feel like it's too high contrast, so I probably would bring down the contrast a little bit. If you bring it down too far, it starts to look really flat. If you go up too high, obviously you start to really throw away information. Your shadow areas got blocked up and your highlights look a little too poppy. For this picture, I probably bring it down to like maybe negative 10 or so. I think that looks pretty good. That looks really pretty close. Now looking at it, I might make another adjustment to the exposure and make it a little darker. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so that's really just setting the exposure. Now again, remember that we haven't touched color or white balance because, again, exposure, setting the white point and the black point and the shadows and highlights will affect the perception of color. So now we go back and we start to mess around with color. And again, even though we're going to be working in black and white, we're going to be changing the white balance and color for this before we bring it into Photoshop, which we'll explain a little bit later. So first we're going to go to the white balance tool, and all you're going to do is just go through these different presets and just see what happens if you change them. You can see auto made it much more blue, daylight makes it really blue, cloudy makes it a little less blue, shade will make it even a little less blue. Tungsten's going to make it very blue because it's saying that the profile for this is tungsten light, which is a very yellow light. The opposite of yellow is blue. So it's pumping a lot of blue into the picture to correct for yellow. Fluorescent, we're not going to really get into fluorescent because we don't really shoot under fluorescent lighting that much anymore, at least traditional fluorescent lighting. Flash, we often do use flash. Really what you're going to do is just kind of make an assessment of the lighting condition that you shot your picture under and start there. For this one, I would probably say shade looked the best to me. And then maybe I would start to work with these two sliders below the shade, the temperature and tint slider. Now just really quickly, we'll get more into this a little bit later too. These sliders are, really kind of an introduction to thinking about the fact that we are working in a three-channeled bitmap, which is rendered in three different channels of red, green, and blue. You see we have three sliders, we don't have, or I'm sorry, two sliders, we don't have three, so that means that in order to get the third slider, you have to move two in conjunction with one another. We have the blue slider, which is right here, and you can see if you crank it up or down, it becomes more blue or yellow. The opposite of blue in the additive process is yellow. And then green, and the opposite of green is magenta. And all these are doing are pumping those values or those colors up or down. I'm going to go back to my white balance and set it back to shade, and you'll see those go back to what was the default. Now, if I felt like this were a little too yellow or too blue, I might start to move this slider a little bit. Maybe it's a little too yellow, so I'm going to move it up a little bit from its default of, I think it was 7,500 or something like that. I don't remember. And you can see it took a little bit of that blue out. And then maybe I look at it and say, it feels a little too green. So if I move the green slider down toward the magenta, before it gets too magenta, I can take a little of that magenta out of the picture. And I think that looks pretty good. And again, I'm not going to really work too long on color balancing this right now. Later on in Photo 2, we get much more into this. But for the purposes of this class, we do want to try to get it kind of close. That will help you if you do go on in photography, but also just for a purpose of converting to black and white later, which we'll talk about later. So that, I think, overall for the color looks pretty good. And the last thing I'm going to do before we hit open and end this first video is just to talk about the sliders below the exposure and the color. And again, we're working in the basic drop-down menu. We have what are called texture, clarity, and dehaze, and all these do really is kind of falsely bump up contrast selectively in specific areas to create either texture, clarity, or a dehazing. So really the first thing I would think about is the conditions in which I photographed under. If you were photographing during the smoke that was in Portland last week, maybe you'd use the dehazing to get rid of some of the haze. So I'm just going to zoom out so you can sort of see what this is doing to the picture overall. The dehazing is definitely bumping up contrast, and I don't know if it's really getting rid of the haze, maybe a little bit. To me, it looks like it's just boosting contrast too much. I am not really going to mess with these here so much because I'm going to do this more selectively later on once I get into Photoshop. Or you can also do it selectively here using some of the tools that are offered up, but I'm not going to really get into this too much right now. We'll get into this more once we get into intermediate and advanced settings. You can mess around with these settings. Just one thing I'll say is use them sparingly. Maybe never above 25 for any of them because you're going to start to get artifacts and they're going to start to get a little crunchy looking and look really non-photographic. One of the goals, at least at the beginning in this class, is to make your pictures hopefully look as you remember when you capture them. The last two sliders refer to the colors in the picture and their quote-unquote purity. Saturation is bumping up the colors and adding more richness to the colors themselves. One thing you want to be careful of is you don't want this to look, kind of falsely, weirdly otherworldly. You also don't want to desaturate the pictures here, turning them into a black and white image. We will do this later on in Photoshop. So really, I would probably use these sparingly just as we use the texture, clarity, and dehaze, really mostly by eye. Saturation will overall bump up the color purities of around in the entire photograph. The vibrance slider bumps up saturation in areas that the picture deems as undersaturated in color. So this was bumping up the kind of duller colors. I do use this sometimes depending on the picture, but for now we're not going to really mess around with those too much. So for the first video, that's primarily it. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to click open. Now if you click open, the picture, again, the raw file is not saving these settings. You're getting what's called an XMP file that is saving these settings that get applied to the raw file, but when it opens in Photoshop, you then have to save that as a different file version, and it will not save over your raw file. So you have to save it as a different file format. So when we click open, it opens in Photoshop. If you click done, that XMP file will be created, but it will not be opening in Photoshop. And then all you have to do to open it is reopen the raw file. And then when you open the raw file, the XMP data is already set. You can go back and re-alter this. This is one of the nice things about having the XMP file not saving over your raw files, that you're able to go back and make alterations if you're not satisfied with the settings that you selected. So for the first video, for just the basic processing in RAW, that is it. All I'm going to do now is click open, and you're going to see the image open in Photoshop, and we will call this first video done.